forward in Matthew 22, we concluded the parable with the wedding garment and just how important it is to make sure that we are putting on those characteristics that are presented by Jesus for us to make sure that we are cultivating in our lives. So even with all that illustration, the whole idea of the wedding garment, and that the attitudes of the Beatitudes are the things that we're supposed to be putting on. The connection that we made, Colossians chapter 3, the things that we're supposed to mortify, which in another sermon we use that same text on how the word mortify actually means to strangle, to put to death by reduction of blood flow. So that is a slow process that takes place in that mortifying and that putting to death of those fleshly things. But it's once you put those things off, or you kill those things off, then you put these other things on. So the very idea that you're putting on a garment, if you have to put these things on and you're clothed, then what's the other implication? That you're naked without these things. So we're needing to make sure that as we're going through and we're taking on these principles, and we have these illustrations that are being presented to us, the picture is being painted of condemnation. Condemnation for the Jews during this time frame, but as we also said, it's condemnation for us if we're going to try to come into the kingdom and not have the wedding garment on. The king came to the man, said, "Friend, why have you come not having a wedding garment on?" He was speechless. The king said, "Bind him up, hand and foot, cast him out." So the same thing is being illustrated for us today as members of the Lord's church. We can be cast out if we're not taking on the responsibility of putting those things on. Then verse 15 comes into play. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. So just as we said, the picture is of condemnation on these Jews that are not producing the fruit that God requires. They are not the kind of people that God had designed for them to be, that the law was supposed to mold them into being. And you can see a very good explanation of that if you read the Roman letter and you read it from that angle. That just simply having the law and doing the law does not make you a Jew. But it's when the law takes effect on the inside, when it changes your attitude, then you are a true Jew. And thus the whole discussion about Gentile, Jew, which one is more of a Jew? And Paul actually says that a Gentile, uncircumcised, but actually obeying the law for what it is, he's more of a Jew than the one that's circumcised and who breaks the law. Now, with these individuals that we have here, they will have about 37 years to get their act together. We're coming up on the crucifixion of Christ. That's around AD 32, AD 33 when that's going to happen. Destruction of Jerusalem is going to be in AD 70. But even when we're considering that, in that span of time, but if you really think about it, there are going to be some that are not going to make it to that point. There are going to be people here that Jesus is talking to that they are going to die before the destruction of Jerusalem happens. So the idea that individuals might have in, well, okay, we've got until this point to get our lives in order and to straighten up and to start doing what Jesus actually says, you can't gauge it that way. That even though in the parable, a lot of that destruction is pointing towards the binding up, sending of the army, so on and so forth, that's pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem. But people are going to meet their Maker before that. So what do you need to do? You need to listen up. And you need to start making changes. But again, we are learning what people will do when they are confronted with their sinful activity. They will try to shift the focus. They will try to bring up a new argument instead of actually dealing with what Jesus actually said. They'll try to bring things in that actually have nothing to do with what the actual conversation is. And we've been looking at that all throughout our Matthew study. So we need to make sure, and so as we're looking at this and we're seeing the Pharisees' activity, we can behave this way, and brethren do behave this way. That when you come to them and you start shining the light on them, what will they immediately start trying to do? This right here. Well, let's try to find some way to wiggle out. And you don't let them do that. And it's with this attitude that we are about to learn what the very heart of sectarianism is, or division, denominationalism. The word heretic, heresy, and sect all come from the same Greek word. So a heretic is one that teaches a heresy, which then produces a sect or a division. And heresy means a self-chosen opinion. So the failure to allow Christ to remold their attitudes and their self-chosen opinion on things produces sectarianism, splits, divisions inside of the nation of Israel. And so division grows from this very attitude and from this very concept. And thus, even here, answering the question, or we're going to get the answer to the question of why would a man teach and hold on to false doctrine? Most of the time, it's because the false doctrine ends up being more convenient to him than the actual truth. You go back to Matthew chapter 5, and you get past the Beatitudes, and Jesus starts pointing out some of the self-chosen opinions of the Pharisees. What were some of the self-chosen opinions? Okay. Okay, keep going.
Lust, but don't commit adultery.
Okay. You can swear on this and swear on that and have to keep it. But if you swear on this lesser thing, you don't have to keep it. Those are all heresies. Those heresies, being taught by heretics, produce a sect, and thus you have Phariseeism. We're going to see the Sadducees in just a moment. And what's the problem with the Sadducees? What's their self-chosen opinion?
Getting it mixed up. They only believe the first 5 books.
No,
so then it's the resurrection.
Yes. Sadducees are the ones that deny a resurrection. They deny angelic beings. They deny just ultimately the spirit, the spirit realm, which is hard to understand if you're going to believe that there's God who is a spirit and then try to deny a spiritual realm. But you see, that's just how crazy heresies are. You can't believe in God and deny a spiritual realm because He lives in a spiritual realm. But you can understand why a Sadducee, we have modern day Sadducees. Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't believe in eternal damnation or a heavenly home. They don't believe that there's a soul that's within man. Just once you die, you die. But yet, here they are claiming to follow God. And He is a spirit. And He's the one that gave us our spirits. So just again, but you can understand why they would want to believe that. If there's no hell, there's no eternal destruction, then how can you live? Any way you want, right? There's no punishment, no eternal damnation.
It's like how we've had discussions in the past, and basically everyone can be a Christian.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, if everyone can be a Christian, then I want to be a Christian because it's everyone else. There's nothing different than the world. So, same with Jehovah's Witness. If there's no hell or damnation, then why be Jehovah's Witness? Why be a part of this denomination out there if there's no point to it? So it's the same thing going, just adding on to what you're saying. Why be a part of anything when anything is everything? So, if that makes sense.
No, that's it. And then even bleeding that over, you have the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons for that matter, who deny the eternal destruction, so there is no hell. But then what does the rest of the religious world say? Jehovah's Witnesses say you can't, or there is no hell. I almost gave it away. What does the rest of the denominational world say?
I don't know what you're going for.
What is once saved, always saved?
There is no hell, or you can't go.
You can't go to hell. That's a self-chosen opinion. Now, they will try, as we'll see with the Sadducees will bring up a biblical principle to try to prove their argument. But when we get there, we'll deal with the problems of it. So, this is what we have to be on the lookout for, are these self-chosen opinions. Now, even with this, some would even try to make this type of accusation against me when it comes to a manner of evangelism. Well, Micah, this is just the way you see to do things. So you're saying that I'm promoting the self-chosen opinion, which is ultimately to say that I'm teaching heresy. And then you want to sit here and go along with it. You're in just as much sin as I am, if what you're saying is true. So people really need to be careful. Like when we make these claims, I understand it firsthand. That if I'm going to make a claim about heresy, I better have my evidence.
Ducks in a row.
Better have my ducks in a row, because that is a serious claim to make. And I'm working on a sermon about false accusers and false accusations. Because when you start digging into what that word actually means, a false accuser or a talebearer, that kind of stuff is low down when you start digging into the Greek and what it actually means. So, but everybody's trying to uphold these positions based upon some type of biblical claim. But as we've gone through our study, we're seeing they're not properly presenting the context or presenting the information. So verse 16, they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians. So the Pharisees are involved in this. They is the they of verse 15. They went out the Pharisees. The Pharisees, sent out unto them their disciples with the Herodians. So they haven't been able to trip Jesus by themselves. What are they doing?
Joining forces.
Now we're joining forces. The Pharisees do not like the Herodians. Herodians don't like the Pharisees, and for that matter, the Pharisees hate the Sadducees on top of that. But here's what they do. Saying, Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. What is all of this? Here are the Herodians, and what are they? Why are they even coming to Jesus?
Would be to trap him.
To entangle him in his talk. That's their purpose. But then they start out like this.
Can't
Butter
think of
him
it.
up.
Yeah, that's better. I was thinking.
All they're trying to do is butter him up. False compliment. So as to get you off your guard. And all of this, thou teachest the way of God in truth. They don't believe that. Because if they did, they would be following him. So all of these are false claims. And that people need to be on the lookout for this kind of stuff. This is how people behave. These are lessons in psychology. What makes people tick? Why will they do the kind of things that they will do? What are the tactics of our enemies that will come in and try to undermine the truth? Here's what they'll do. They'll talk you up. They'll try to butter you up. Tell us, therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? So Jesus knows, he sees through all of this. Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. Now, the Herodians are purely politicians. These are people that are in allegiance with Herod. And Herod is in allegiance to whom?
Caesar.
Caesar. So what about this question? When we're thinking about what is happening here, and especially the wisdom that Christ has and the answer that he gives, and the request that he makes, show me the tribute money. He knew they had it, and that they would be able to turn it over. And it's just like, okay, if you have a problem with this, then why are you carrying around his money? Why do you even acknowledge it if it's a problem? But you see, the Herodians are in the back pocket of the Romans. So the question, do they really care about what they're asking? No. Is there an ulterior motive to the question?
Yes.
What is it?
It's to get him to go against Caesar.
Okay. John 19:14-15. It was the preparation of the Passover in about the 6th hour, and he said unto the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate saith unto them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar.
Buttering up.
There is the motive. We can't touch him. But if we can make some type of accusation against him that he's trying to undermine Caesar, then we'll have Rome do our dirty work for us. And it wasn't just with Jesus that they tried to do this. Who else did they try to do this with?
Paul.
Acts 25, verse 8. While he answered for himself, Neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. This is what they're up to. They are trying to find something so that they can run back to Caesar with an accusation and say, Aha, you see here, this is what he said. He told the people they shouldn't pay tax to you. And the response that Jesus gives, so like when we are considering this and we're thinking about what Jesus' answer is, Jesus' answer really is not about any lawful position as to whether or not we should give tax. He doesn't even get into that because he knows that's not what they're after. All you're wanting is some type of snippet, some little soundbite, so you can run back to Caesar and say, he said this. So when we're considering this section and what it is actually trying to teach, we need to be careful, but then at the same time, we don't need to go to the other extreme. To where we have those inside of our country, Turning Point USA, they just say, well, taxation is theft. Well, hold on a minute. Is all taxation theft? No. Didn't God have a tax system? Yes. Huh?
For the poor.
Well, not just for the poor.
It was
So you have the temple tax, but you also just, the tithe was for the tribe of Levi, as well as for the poor and for the orphans and anybody else that might be in need.
But it wasn't an overabundant amount.
Exactly.
It's now turning into stealing.
Exactly.
It was just a certain amount that God set up.
The amount, and what was the amount?
10%.
It was a tenth. And that was it across the board. Now granted, 10% is going to look different for every person. But 10% is still 10%. And then on top of that, you do not have God taxing the 10% of the 10% of the 10%. Like what you have going on in our system. Because, I mean, logically, you just can't do that. That doesn't make any sense. So when we are looking at our tax system and our tax code, it is theft. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. But you cannot take that type of mentality and just say, well, all of it's bad. Because as you go through the Old Testament, the taxation that was being done was for a purpose, a real purpose. Now, a lot of the stuff that we're being taxed on, we have no need of. Housing for these people that want to be on government assistance? No. Single motherhood? No. Abortions and all that kind of stuff? No. I mean, when you're looking at what government is actually designed to do, government is there to protect people. How's our government doing on protecting us?
Not that good.
I mean, we've got a Chinese spy balloon flying over our country.
Our state?
Yeah, the state, yeah, our state, Montana. And our government's not doing anything about it. Why would we give you our money when you're not even doing what you're supposed to do? So as we said, the tithe was a tax to take care of the Levites, but even with that, the Levites also paid a tithe on what they got. So everybody's involved in the system. And there were no loopholes like what we have in our system that allows people to escape the taxation. So there again, we're seeing a huge difference between what we have and what God is actually stipulating. Everyone is paying under God's system. And so as we mentioned, the widows, the orphans are involved in being helped with that tithe system. But even with that, it was not without regulations. Because also under the Old Testament system, if you were a widow, but you had somebody that was there to take care of you, what were you commanded to do? So actually there's a two-part situation in the commandment. Landowners, what were they commanded to do in the time of harvest?
Give off a certain part of their land.
You leave the corners. You do not harvest the corners. Those are for the widows and the poor. But even with that, what is the command for the widows and those that are poor and in need?
Don't take more than you need.
Okay, well that goes both ways. For the landowner, it's keeping them from being stingy. It's like, okay, you're being taken care of, here's this excess, you leave it. But for the widows and the poor during that time frame, it wasn't just bundled up and boxed up for them and delivered to them. God said, you come and get it.
You work, you don't eat.
Exactly. So even under that system where God is making provisions, it's not a free ride. It's not a handout. You go get it and you bring it in for yourself. So when we're thinking about it, this response and this conversation, in light of all of that, we need to make sure that we're keeping it in its context. This is not a discourse on whether we should pay taxes or not today. So he saith unto them, bring me a penny. Whose image and superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. When they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. Jesus answers knowing their intentions. You render to Caesar's what is Caesar's. Caesar has the authority. He's the one in charge. He's the ruler. You are his subjects, and that by conquest. Rome came in and overthrew the Greeks. You Jews are in bondage. So you obey who's in charge of you. But even with that, are we to ignore other passages of Scripture when we're thinking about this context? Is this just a flat out, or even for that matter, Romans 13, where everybody wants to run to? It's just like, well, you got to obey the government. Is that how we deal with Scripture? Is that how we do Bible study?
Sounds like God and the things that are God's.
Doesn't that sound like what Peter and John say to the Jews in Acts chapter 4 and Acts chapter 5? When we can, we obey men. But who are we supposed to obey first?
God.
We obey God rather than man. I am not under any obligation to just blindly follow government ordinance. And especially considering the fact, as we said, with the Jews and their relationship to Rome at this time, they are not free citizens. They are slaves to the Romans. They don't have any rights. They don't have any privileges. They do not have any liberties. Now, you transfer that over to where we are today. I don't live that way. I'm a citizen. I have liberties. There are laws that protect me as a citizen of this country. So if we really want to get a proper view of where we stand, it's not here. You go back to the Old Testament for where we stand. And in the Old Testament, they rose up against their kings that did unjustly. And not just the kings, the queens also. They threw Jezebel from a balcony. And God blessed them. So this idea that, well, we're just Christians and we just got to be submissive to the government. Maybe if I was overtaken by another country, sure. But that's not how we operate. So the things that belong to Caesar, you render to Caesar. But then, unto God, the things that are God's. So why make this comparison? Because you got to remember who the Herodians are. Who are the Herodians?
Is it what you said earlier? They're the politicians that work for Caesar?
Yeah.
Well, they're still Jews, aren't they?
Okay. They're Jews.
So they should know the law.
Okay.
And should know all these things that Jesus is speaking of. So it's again saying, have you not heard?
Right.
So it's a smack in their face.
So for them to question about, remember what the question was. Is it lawful? As if you really care what the law says. And if you really cared about the law, then you would understand already from the Scriptures. Of course, it is right and proper to give tribute. It is right and it is proper to pay the tax. Because under your system, the Jewish system, you're already paying a tax. So you know that's right. And even for that matter, as we said, the Herodians are in league with the Romans. Do you really think they want people to stop paying taxes? No, they don't want people to stop paying taxes. They get paid from the taxes. Everything about their question is dishonest. And Jesus shows that with his answer. You're worried about rendering unto Caesar when you should really be worried about rendering unto God the things that are God's. So Caesar is in charge, yes, nationally, physically. He is in authority, but there's an authority above Caesar. There's a ruler that goes beyond his rule, and that's God. Therefore, render to God what is his, which is everything. And the fact that here are the Herodians, Pharisees, asking about that which is lawful and making sure that we're rendering unto Caesar, and then you think about what they're supposed to be rendering unto God. And so all of this is going to come into play in Matthew 23. He's not done when we leave this chapter. You get into Matthew 23, and it talks about rendering the things unto God. And then you look at the things that the Pharisees are doing. Making long prayers while devouring widows' houses. And you honestly want me to get into a discourse with you about whether it's lawful to pay taxes or not? No way.
That's why he calls them hypocrites.
Exactly. So that's in Matthew 23. That's why he goes through the long list of calling them hypocrites. So here we have a lesson in trying to deal with certain people. Here they are, and they're trying to bait him and drag him into an argument. And Jesus answers in a way so that when they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. You're not really concerned about the authority to Caesar, because look at how you treat God.
Which is funny because they start off saying, we can tell that you
That's right.
speak God and you don't care about man like they knew.
Yep.
They knew anything.
And all of that, so all that is just trying to lead him into, okay, you don't take any concern for men. Yeah, that's right, I don't. Okay, then what about Caesar? But you see there, Jesus recognizes, which they should have recognized. Rome is a weapon of God. Who put Rome in charge? God did. You go back in Daniel chapter 2 and you see the great image in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of all these different kingdoms that are going to come in. Rome is a part of that. So what does Jesus recognize? What should they all have recognized? God put Caesar there. So what about trying to stand up to Caesar? There's nothing you can do about it. This is God's judgment on the people, and you just have to take it. Now, of course, with the Old Testament prophets, they were being told, hey, if you will surrender, if you will obey, everything will be fine. But the Jews just constantly have this problem, this nationalistic problem that kept getting them in trouble. But even then, if they had obeyed what Jesus was saying and what Jesus was presenting, there'd be no need for the destruction of Jerusalem. If the Jews had stopped behaving rebelliously and just trying to get things stirred up, it would have been just like what Jeremiah said, you can live in peace. But the Jews wouldn't have it because they have all these problems going on internally. And those internal problems end up bleeding out into the rest of society. So any thoughts, comments, questions on this attempt by the Herodians before we move into the Sadducees? All right, so they went away, having failed, but they're not done yet. The same day came to him the Sadducees, which say that there is no resurrection, and asked him, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die, having no children, his brother shall marry his wife, and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there were with us 7 brethren, and the first, when he had married a wife, deceased, and having no issue, left his wife unto his brother. So here's what is trying to take place in the midst of all of this. And really all of these are the same. The Pharisees, the Herodians, the Sadducees, they're not coming with serious matters. All these are just quibbles. These are just minor arguments that they're having amongst themselves and trying to, trap him in what they think is an unanswerable position. Because I'm sure the Pharisees, with how this is laid out, the Pharisees could not answer this. So the Sadducees have seen, the Pharisees could not stump him, the Herodians could not trip him up, so they try. So as we mentioned, they do not believe there's a resurrection. They could be labeled as modernists, skeptics, agnostics of the day. And that because they did not believe in spirits or angels in that heavenly realm. Now, here's what they're trying to do. Now, notice, as we said, they asked him, Master, Moses said. See what people will try to do for their self-chosen opinion? They'll try to bring you to the Bible. Moses said, if a man die, having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother, so on and so forth. Now, what they're doing is they are presenting an argument that is so ridiculous, and this is a fallacy in logic, and it's called reductio ad absurdum, which simply means it's an argument off of absurdity. This has got to be so crazy that it would never happen, and therefore the position is untrue. And people do this today. They use this type of argumentation. You got a little kid and they come to their parents and they say, well, I want to go do such and such. No, you can't do it. Well, Tommy's parents, and then what's the response of the parents? No, not quite. Tommy's parents are going to let him do this. Well, if Tommy's parents let him jump off a bridge, are you going to do it too? That's the same type of fallacy. Not everything that Tommy's parents are going to let Tommy do is going to be detrimental to him. But you're making this big overblown argument that's just so crazy, and it's like, well, no. And that's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to blow this up, which even in this context, when you're thinking about Moses said this, so on and so forth, you go back into the Old Testament, this has no connection to the resurrection. So why are you trying to connect the two? It's not even the same context, number one. So, here's what they do. He marries, dies, leaves the wife with no offspring. Likewise the second also, and the third unto the seventh. And last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the seven? For they all had her. Again, we're learning how people will argue and the type of arguments that they'll try to present. This is just stupid on its face. To try to make these two connections. These things are not connected. And just because you have tried to connect them does not mean that you've made a good argument. But that's what people do. They knew, so here's what we have. They knew the Scriptures. They've already brought up Moses. But the response Jesus gives, Jesus answered and said unto them, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God. So what Jesus is about to quote, they knew it. They knew it existed. And they had read it many times. But when Jesus is making the statement of not knowing the Scripture, what does that mean? You don't understand it. There's plenty of people that can quote certain passages. That doesn't mean you know what it means. But it's not only that. It's not only understanding what the Scripture says, but it's also an acknowledgement of the power of God in that as well. So even with that, let's grant them that this was even true. Okay, let's grant them that in the resurrection, she was going to be somebody's husband. Or, excuse me, somebody's wife. If I understand the power of God, that's not going to be a problem. Like, why are you presenting that as though it is a problem? Knowing the power of God. He created all of this out of nothing. And then you want to act like this is impossible for Him. Or too difficult for Him. So just grant them the argument and throw it back on them. Are you saying that God, in all of His power, and all of His wisdom, can't make this possible? So their argument goes out the window. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. Here we have Jesus giving early teaching of what it is they should have been understanding even throughout the Old Testament. And that of the power of God. That had they paid attention to what they were reading. So first, we have been shown to us by Jesus and His teaching on this point of the resurrection. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage. Why? But are as the angels of God in heaven. There's a change that takes place. when a person dies. There's a change that is taking place in order for the resurrection to actually happen. Now, as we are discussing this, which resurrection are we talking about? Because there are different kinds of resurrection throughout the Scriptures, are there not?
Like Jesus' resurrection?
Well, not only just Jesus' resurrection.
And Lazarus?
Lazarus?
And the kid that fell out the window?
No. Think about Romans 6.
Resurrection and baptism.
We have a resurrection that takes place in baptism. We are buried with Him so that we may be raised to walk in newness of life. Now, what kind of resurrection is that?
Spiritual.
That's a spiritual resurrection. What kind of resurrection are we talking about in this context? A man that marries, dies, so on and so forth.
Be spiritual again, wouldn't it?
No, this is physical.
Well, they're trying to make spiritual physical, right?
Who?
Oh, the Sadducees, because they don't believe in heaven.
Right.
Yeah, they're trying to make it physical.
I'm understanding.
No, I think you're overthinking it. This is all a physical conversation.
Yes.
A man marries a woman, physically, dies. Then what about this resurrection that's taking place? This is talking about physical. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because our brethren that are in the 80-70 camp, they want to try to go here and start trying to make all this spiritual. Well, this is talking about the resurrection that takes place when one is brought into the kingdom. No. The kingdom is not even mentioned in this context. We've moved on from the parable. Now we're dealing with these questions that are being brought about. This is a physical conversation dealing with physical death and that resurrection. That resurrection from the dead. If that is true, so here's the thing. The Sadducees deny that. They deny a resurrection. And here's the basis. They're trying to say, well, if that is true, then she's going to be somebody's wife over in the resurrection. And that just doesn't make any sense. Well, it doesn't make any sense to you, but just because it doesn't make any sense to you doesn't even mean that's not true. But it is untrue because in the resurrection, we don't have the same relationship. They neither marry nor are given in marriage because they are as the angels of God. So there is a change that takes place. So number one, a change happens. And that marriage is no more in this realm. So even with that, the 80-70 group has an issue when they start trying to figure that out into where we are in the kingdom. I mean, you two just got married recently. We shouldn't have allowed that if we are in the state that they're referencing that we are in, because of a change that's taken place. So I'm trying to keep my points in order, and we're kind of crisscrossing, so give me just a moment here. Okay, so even as we're thinking about this change, this resurrection that happens, let me ask it this way. When people read about the resurrection that takes place, at what point in time do people think that this change is going to happen? So just think about some of your other scriptures. 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4.
That's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Is you raised from the dead and you're caught up in the air.
Okay.
In clouds.
And then you're changed.
Yes.
But is that what we have being presented from this context?
I have no idea.
Because here's the next point. But as touching the resurrection of the dead, have ye not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham and of Isaac and the God of Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive somewhere, which means they must have what? They have to have a body. The change is taking place. So even as we're considering this point, in the resurrection they are neither married nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. That's not a situation where you have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're sitting over in the Hadean realm waiting for the second coming, and they're waiting for themselves to be changed. They are changed. You can't go into that other realm in your physical state, can you? So you've got to change. So when we are looking at the resurrection, now I agree that there is going to be a resurrection in the future, just as it's laid out in 1 Corinthians 15, as it is laid out 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But when a person dies before that point, they're changed. If they are alive in that other realm, it implies a change has taken place.
Because that's where Moses and Elijah were.
Exactly. And Moses and Elijah appeared in Matthew 17, and they appeared in some type of form. Now, I don't know what that form is, but they appeared as something. A change happened. And thus the argument that Jesus is presenting for them. You don't know the Scriptures, you're not understanding, you're not comprehending, you're allowing your self-chosen opinions to get in the way to blind you from what you should have clearly seen.
With this, how Moses came back in a physical or some sort of being, I've had discussions with a Baptist about, when he dies, he's going to be able to return back to the earth and visit, and then keep going back and forth between, I don't know if his point was heaven or the Hadean realm or something like that, but he's able to come back and go back. So with the rich man and Lazarus, there's a
divide.
Yeah, there's a divide between the two. Is there a divide between the Hadean realm and Earth in that sense? If you're following my question, because if Moses was able to come back, what about everyone else?
Well, and the thing with Moses, Elijah, Samuel under the Old Testament system, that is based upon an allowance of God. So even with that, so as we're thinking about from the Sadducee standpoint, what would they do with those accounts? Samuel coming back from the dead. Well, how is that possible if there is no resurrection? And the resurrection implies a change. He's alive. So even with Matthew 17, it was just Jesus and a few of his apostles that were there. But yeah, I mean, so even in the Old Testament, you had people being raised from the dead. Well, how is that possible if you're dead, that's it? There is no spirit, there is no soul to be brought back. So yeah, to that point, that individual's making a huge assertion, because all of those accounts are based upon God allowing those things to actually happen. So just him having this idea, well, yeah, I'm just going to be able to do this, blah, 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 it's like, nah, you're taking way too much upon yourself. But even with that can be shown with the rich man who's in torment, and he makes the request for Lazarus to be sent back. And Abraham says, no. There's no need for that. They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them if they're wanting to escape what it is that you have, or what it is that you're enduring and what they have coming towards them. So, yeah, there really wouldn't be any type of scriptural basis that he'd be able to lean on. It would be a huge presumption on his part to look at those type of accounts and say, well, yeah, that's going to be me too. No, not going to happen.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify and get it working my own brain
Yeah.
on how to debate, if you will, or how to reason it out. So, thank you.
And the second point, so he lays out the first point, and the second point is to build on top of that. The scriptures prove the resurrection is true. And this is a quote from Exodus 3 and verse 6. Moses standing before God, or before the burning bush, and where God says to Moses, I am the God of Abraham, I am the God of Isaac, I am the God of Jacob. Abraham has been dead for hundreds of years up to this point in Exodus chapter 3. But God speaks of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as though they're still alive. He doesn't say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am, present tense, currently. And if they, the Sadducees, has understood this, they would know that the resurrection is real. So just with that, when we're thinking about our study and the kind of attention that we need to be giving to our reading and to our studying, this is showing you just how plugged in you have to be. In Exodus chapter 3, there is no mention of the word resurrection. It's not there. And even for that matter, when you go through the Old Testament, I don't think the word resurrection is ever used in the Old Testament. But you can find it alluded to by statements like this. That if you're really paying attention and you read, I am the God of Abraham. Well, Abraham's dead. No, he's alive.
David and his child.
Yeah, David and his child. He cannot come to me, but I will go to him. Where? In the spiritual realm. So if they had understood, they would have known this to be real. But to solve all problems is found in the admittance of the power of God. To where the Sadducees are looking at this and they're saying, okay, Jesus, explain this in its detail and how it's going to work in the resurrection. Number one, these two things are not connected, but even then, when it comes to things that are over in the heavenly realm, do I have to explain that? Do I have to explain to you every single little bit of what's going to happen on the other side? No, I don't. But I know the power of God and that whatever He says about it is actually true. So in their question about, well, how could the resurrection happen? I do not have all the details. And even for that matter, Paul, writing to the 1 Corinthian brethren, in 1 Corinthians 15, and the question is brought up about what kind of body will we have in the resurrection? What's the response that Paul gives?
We will be changed.
Well, we will be changed. But there's something before that.
Do not know.
He first says, that's a foolish question to ask. And then the response is, he doesn't know. Nobody knows. But I know we're going to have something. And just because I cannot fully explain how the resurrection is going to happen, that doesn't cause me to lose any sleep at night. Because I know the power of God. That idea does not bother me. It doesn't worry me. Well, how does baptism, one being baptized in water, how does that take away sins on your soul? I cannot go into every little detail as to how that works either. But I know the power of God, and that He said, if you'll do this, then I will cleanse you. Okay. You're the one that created all of this out of nothing. You created the first man out of clay. You breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and then I want to start stumbling at this? I may know what the Bible says, but I don't understand it. How that God could produce a child with a man that's in his hundreds and a woman that was beyond being able to give birth to a child? God has the power to do that, but God doesn't have the power to do this? So when it comes to this realm and these type of questions, most of our denominational friends are in the realm of Sadducee. So to a large degree, when we've been labeling them incorrectly. They're not over in the camp of Phariseeism, they're over in the camp of Sadduceeism. That when it comes to what God says that He will do, and then our denominational friends want to start making these outlandish claims and these outlandish arguments, thinking that that proves anything. And then to take clear scriptures where Jesus, the Son of God Himself, He Himself says, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved." How could that possibly happen? You're doubting the power of God. The same God that raised His Son from the dead after being in the grave for 3 days, He can do that. But He just can't do this. You do err not knowing the Scriptures and not knowing the power of God. How could the universe, earth, and everything in it be made in 6 literal 24-hour days? I don't have all the details in that. But I do know the power of God. And what the Scriptures have already said on it. Well, what did it look like? Give me some explanation. I can't and I won't. But that's how the Pharisees are arguing. Well, expound on it. Go into detail. We have this question. Just because you have a question doesn't mean it needs an answer. So when we're getting over into the realm of the letters being written to Timothy and the letters that are being written to Titus about foolish questions, this layout that the Sadducees are laying out is a foolish question. You guys ought to know better. Number one, that the resurrection is real, and that number two, your argument has nothing to do with the resurrection. You're lumping two things together that are not correlations, apples and oranges, as to what's going on here in the physical realm, as to what's going to go on in the spiritual realm. Now, I know we lumped in a good bit with that Sadducee section, but it's just because it's used for a whole lot. From people outside of the Lord's church and even with our own brethren and their self-chosen opinions on what's being discussed. So any thoughts, questions, comments on the Sadducees and their false argument? Okay, 34. When the Pharisees had heard that He had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together, so they're not stopping. When they should be realizing, okay, we just cannot fight against this guy, we've got to keep going, then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked Him a question, tempting Him and saying, "Master, which is the great commandment in the law?" Now watch this. Which is the great commandment in the law? Which one is the great commandment? So you see, we're right in the same boat with the rich young ruler. What's this one thing that I'm needing for eternal life? Jesus said unto him, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind." This is the first and great commandment. And the second, in the ASV, actually has a second as like unto it. "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets." This word second in the Greek is the word deuteros, which finds its connection to Deuteronomy, which is a retelling or a second telling. And the word is laying out that this is a second, but it is a second in time, place, or rank, but these things are actually tied together. That though this one may come first, this is growing out of this. So they're not separated, like the Beatitudes. So remember, in Matthew chapter 4, two of the answers that Jesus gave to the devil actually came from Deuteronomy chapter 6. This first answer, Jesus said unto them, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This first answer is not from Exodus 20. And specifically, Exodus 20 and the giving of the law and receiving of the 10 Commandments. That's not where he goes for his reference. But this is being quoted from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Now the second answer, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The second is from Leviticus 19:18. Now it's interesting that Jesus would use a quotation from the book of Leviticus. And we need to reason through this point to align it over so as to make sure that we are understanding what's being presented. As a whole, a majority, what is the book of Leviticus about? All right? The law, the priesthood, sacrifices, all those types of things. So when we're thinking about Jesus going to the book about the Levites and about the priests, sacrifice, tabernacle, laws and ordinances, that in all of those discussions, and all discussions of those things, you have this mentioned. Thou shalt not avenge, nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. And all throughout this context, this is dealing with communal dealings. How to deal with your neighbors. And at the conclusion of it, God says this. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Chapter 19 of Leviticus shows the intended effect of that system on the lives of the people and their attitudes towards one another. That in keeping these things, it is based upon having love for those that are around me. What that shows is that love is a spiritual precept. It's not just an emotion that we have or that we feel. It is actually a commanded precept of God. That's the reason why you have 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, to where Paul writes to these brethren, he says, even if you do all these wonderful things, but it's not done with charity, it profits nothing. Love, charity is where all of this begins. So Paul says this. So what determines the value of any action is found right here. See the same things in Matthew chapter 10, verse 42. And whosoever shall give to drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water, only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall in no wise lose his reward. Love will take something small and insignificant and make it great. And then when you attach what Mark has to say about it, Mark 9:41, for whosoever shall give you a cup of water to drink in my name, notice, because you belong to Christ. Verily I say unto you, he shall not lose his reward. Hebrews 6:10, for God is not unrighteous to forget your work and labor of love, which you have showed toward his name, in that ye have ministered to the saints and do minister. To do this in the name of God, in my name, by his authority, is equal to loving God. Giving cold water to a neighbor because they love God. And if I love God as I'm supposed to, that love is going to branch out to those that are around us. So what Jesus has done, what Jesus has given, the foundation for obedience. He took love, drove a nail through it, and he said, you can hang every commandment on that. And that's even what Paul does in the Romans letter. Yeah, okay, yeah. Romans 13:9, for this thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying. You want to know what this is all about. Here it is in a nutshell. Namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. If I love my neighbor as myself, I'm not going to covet his wife. If I love my neighbor as myself, I will not hate him, nor find any way so as to murder him, to steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness. If I love my neighbor as myself, I will not talk about him behind his back. Shalt not covet. And that because of this. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. You want to you want to fulfill the law, then you must love God. And to love God is to love your neighbor as yourself. So this is the master motive involved in that process. Verse 41, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what think ye of Christ? And we're not going to have time to get into this today, because we got close to where I wanted to be, but we're not going to be able to have enough time to break this down.
No.
So as we're, even with this point, and we're thinking about what the Pharisees have brought up, the questions, the arguments they've tried to bring up, what the Herodians have tried to bring up, and the Sadducees, what they've tried to bring up, what they are showing by their actions and by their deeds is that they really do not love God. Because if they really did love God, then they would love others as they're supposed to. But they're devouring others. They are abusing others. And these very things that they teach that the law says you're supposed to uphold, they are involved in those very things. So it's just as Paul wrote to Titus and saying, with their mouths, they profess God. But with their deeds and with their actions, they deny Him. Your words and your actions must link up. And if they don't, then you can't make this type of claim. So we'll stop there, verse 40. Thoughts, questions, comments on the parables and the attempts to trip Jesus up and tangle Jesus in his speech.